The frozen morning of February 13, 1945, found Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler at his command post for Army Group Vistula in Pomerania, receiving the final radio transmission from Budapest, reporting that German and Hungarian forces defending the city had been destroyed and that organized resistance had ceased. The message marked the end of 50-day siege that had consumed 2 German armies attempting to relieve the garrison, had destroyed substantial SS formations that Himmler commanded, had demonstrated that even Hitler's most powerful subordinate could not reverse military disasters through ideological determination and ruthless discipline alone. Himmler, who had been appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, despite lacking military training or experience commanding field forces, who had assured Hitler that Budapest could be held or relieved through application of SS will and National Socialist spirit, who had ordered multiple relief operations that had failed with catastrophic casualties, was confronting evidence that military realities could not be overcome through ideological fervor or through threats against commanders who reported that missions were impossible. The fall of Budapest represented not just tactical defeat, but demonstration that Himmler's authority over SS and police apparatus did not translate into competence at operational command, that political reliability was insufficient qualification for military leadership, that the gap between Nazi ideology's claims and Wehrmacht's deteriorating capabilities had become unbridgeable. The background to Himmler's involvement with Budapest traced to the October 1944 Soviet offensive that had driven into Hungary and had surrounded the capital by late December. Budapest's strategic importance derived from its position on the Danube, its role as communications center, and its symbolic value as last major Axis capital still in German hands. Hitler had ordered that Budapest be held at all costs, had designated it as Fortress City to be defended regardless of operational situation, had committed substantial forces to its defense, including significant SS formations. The commitment reflected Hitler's pattern of demanding that positions be held for political and symbolic reasons, even when military logic dictated withdrawal. General Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, commanding the 9th SS Mountain Corps that formed core of Budapest garrison, had received orders in late December emphasizing that the city must be held and that no withdrawal was authorized even if Soviet forces completed encirclement. Pfeffer Wildenbruch understood that being trapped in Budapest by Soviet forces would result in garrison's eventual destruction, that the defensive value of holding the city did not justify sacrificing the divisions assigned to its defense, that operationally sound approach would be to withdraw before encirclement was complete. Pfeffer Wildenbruch's objections were overruled with emphasis that Führer's orders must be obeyed and that Budapest's defense was critical to maintaining German position in Hungary. The December 27th completion of Soviet encirclement of Budapest trapped approximately 100,000 German and Hungarian troops in the city, along with civilian population of over 800,000. The garrison included substantial SS formations, whose presence reflected Nazi leadership's confidence that ideologically motivated troops would fight more effectively than regular Wehrmacht forces. The SS divisions in Budapest represented significant proportion of remaining elite German formations. Their loss would be felt across the entire Eastern Front. Their commitment to static defense demonstrated misallocation of mobile forces to missions where their capabilities could not be exploited. SS Obergruppenführer Karl von Pfeffer Wildenbruch's assessment on December 28 that garrison possessed supplies for perhaps 4 weeks, if rationed strictly, and that relief must arrive within that time frame or breakout must be authorized, received response from Hitler's headquarters that relief operations were being organized and that garrison must hold until relieved. The response provided no timeline for when relief might arrive, offered no details about forces being committed to relief operations, demanded that garrison maintain defense without information needed to plan rationally for how long defense must be sustained. The January 1945 relief operations that Himmler ordered demonstrated his approach to military command: massive commitment of forces to achieve objectives that Hitler demanded, regardless of whether operational conditions made success feasible. The first relief attempt, beginning January 1st, involved IVSS Panzerkorps under SS Obergruppenführer Herbert Giller attacking from the southwest toward Budapest. The operation committed elite SS Panzer divisions, including Totenkopf and Wiking, whose loss would be catastrophic, but whose employment reflected Himmler's conviction that SS formations could achieve what Wehrmacht forces could not. The operational planning for the first relief attempt revealed fundamental problems with Himmler's approach to military command. The planning occurred in atmosphere where questioning mission feasibility was characterized as defeatism, where intelligence assessments suggesting Soviet strength exceeded German capabilities were dismissed as pessimism, where professional military judgments that contradicted what Himmler wanted to hear were rejected. The resulting plan committed forces to attack against Soviet defenses whose strength had not been adequately assessed, along routes whose suitability for armored operations had not been properly reconnoitered, with logistic support that assumed success rather than planning for extended operations. The intelligence about Soviet forces surrounding Budapest indicated that Red Army had concentrated multiple armies totaling hundreds of thousands of troops, specifically to defend against German relief attempts. Soviet command understood that German forces would attempt to break through to Budapest, had positioned armor and artillery to defend likely approach routes, had prepared defensive positions in depth to prevent breakthrough even if initial positions were penetrated. The Soviet preparations meant that any German relief attempt would face prepared defenses by numerically superior forces occupying favorable terrain. SS Obergruppenführer Herbert Giller, commanding 4th SS Panzerkorps, received orders from Himmler to break through Soviet forces surrounding Budapest and to relieve the garrison regardless of casualties or losses. Giller understood that his corps would be attacking into heavily defended Soviet positions, that Soviet forces had concentrated substantial armor and artillery around Budapest specifically to defeat relief attempts, that achieving breakthrough would require overwhelming superiority that his corps did not possess. Giller's professional military judgment was that relief operation had minimal chance of success, but expressing such assessment to Himmler would result in accusations of defeatism and possibly relief from command. The terrain over which the 4th SS Panzer Corps would advance presented significant challenges that operational planning inadequately addressed. The area southwest of Budapest was crisscrossed by streams and drainage ditches that channeled armor movement into predictable routes where Soviet defensive fire could be concentrated. The winter weather had created muddy conditions that reduced mobility, prevented off-road movement that might have avoided Soviet prepared positions, increased mechanical breakdown rates for German armor. The terrain and weather advantages favored defenders and created obstacles that attacking forces would struggle to overcome. The January 1st to 12th fighting as the 4th SS Panzer Corps advanced toward Budapest demonstrated both the tactical competence of SS formations and the operational futility of relief attempts against prepared Soviet defenses. Giller's forces achieved initial penetrations against Soviet positions, advanced to within 30 kilometers of Budapest's perimeter, created hope among garrison that relief might actually succeed. Yet Soviet reserves committed to blocking the advance outnumbered German forces. Soviet defensive positions channeled German armor into killing zones where it could be engaged by massed anti-tank weapons. Soviet counterattacks exploited German overextension to threaten encirclement of the relief force itself. The specific tactical engagements during first relief attempt illustrated problems that doomed the operation. German armor, advancing along roads to maintain momentum, encountered Soviet anti-tank positions that destroyed lead vehicles and blocked routes, forcing time-consuming clearing operations that slowed advance and allowed Soviet forces to reinforce threatened sectors. German infantry supporting armor attacks suffered heavy casualties from Soviet artillery and mortar fire, reducing effectiveness of combined arms operations that were essential for penetrating defensive positions. German forces that achieved local penetrations found themselves isolated when Soviet forces closed gaps behind them, creating situations where penetrating forces had to fight their way back to German lines rather than exploiting breakthroughs. The logistics problems that emerged during first relief attempt demonstrated inadequate operational planning. Fuel consumption exceeded planned rates because of difficult terrain and because of detours required when direct routes were blocked by Soviet defenses. Ammunition expenditure exceeded estimates because of intensity of Soviet resistance and because of ammunition wasted in engagements that achieved minimal results. Medical services were overwhelmed by casualty rates that exceeded planning assumptions, forcing wounded to be evacuated to rear areas under conditions that increased mortality. The logistics difficulties validated concerns that professional staff officers had raised during planning, but that had been dismissed as defeatist. SS Obergruppenführer Herbert Giller, commanding 4th SS Panzer Corps, received orders from Himmler to break through Soviet forces surrounding Budapest and to relieve the garrison regardless of casualties or losses. Giller understood that his corps would be attacking into heavily defended Soviet positions, that Soviet forces had concentrated substantial armor and artillery around Budapest specifically to defeat relief attempts, that achieving breakthrough would require overwhelming superiority that his corps did not possess. Giller's professional military judgment was that relief operation had minimal chance of success, but expressing such assessment to Himmler would result in accusations of defeatism and possibly relief from command. The January 1st to 12th fighting as the 4th SS Panzer Corps advanced toward Budapest demonstrated both the tactical competence of SS formations and the operational futility of relief attempts against prepared Soviet defenses. Giller's forces achieved initial penetrations against Soviet positions, advanced to within 30 kilometers of Budapest's perimeter, created hope among garrison that relief might actually succeed. Yet Soviet reserves committed to blocking the advance outnumbered German forces. Soviet defensive positions channeled German armor into killing zones where it could be engaged by massed anti-tank weapons. Soviet counterattacks exploited German overextension to threaten encirclement of the relief force itself. The January 12th decision to halt IVSS Panzer Corps' advance and to withdraw to defensive positions represented recognition that relief attempt had failed and that continuing would result in Corps' destruction. Giller reported to Himmler that Soviet defenses could not be broken with available forces, that casualties had reduced Corps' effective strength below level where sustained offensive operations were possible, that withdrawing preserved combat capability that would be needed for defensive operations. Himmler's response blamed Giller for insufficient determination, insisted that greater effort would have achieved breakthrough, refused to acknowledge that operational plan had been fundamentally flawed. The preparations for second relief attempt that began immediately after first attempt's failure demonstrated Himmler's refusal to accept that Budapest garrison could not be relieved through conventional military operations. The second relief, designated Operation Conrad III, involved transferring additional SS Panzer divisions to Hungary, concentrating forces for attack from different direction than first attempt, committing reserves that were desperately needed elsewhere to operation whose prospects for success were no better than first attempts had been. SS Brigadeführer Sylvester Stadler, commanding the Hohenstaufen SS Panzer Division transferred to Hungary for Conrad III, received briefing from Himmler's staff emphasizing that Budapest must be relieved, that second attempt would succeed where first had failed, that SS division superiority over Soviet forces would enable breakthrough that first attempt had not achieved. Stadler's professional assessment, after examining operational plan, was that second attempt faced same Soviet defenses that had defeated first attempt, that transferring attack to different sector did not change fundamental problem of Soviet numerical superiority, that committing additional SS divisions to failed strategy compounded initial error rather than correcting it. The January 18th to 27th fighting during Conrad III demonstrated that Soviet forces had learned from first relief attempt and had prepared defenses that prevented German forces from approaching Budapest as closely as Gila's Corps had achieved. The attacking SS divisions encountered fortified positions, extensive minefields, concentrated artillery fire that destroyed German armor, attempting to penetrate Soviet lines. The advance stalled within days at distances from Budapest that made relief impossible. The casualties mounted without corresponding gains. The operation's failure became apparent even to commanders who had been ordered to maintain optimistic assessments. The reports that reached Himmler about Conrad III's failure included assessments from multiple commanders that Soviet defenses could not be broken, that German losses were unsustainable, that continuing relief attempts would destroy SS Panzer divisions without achieving objective. Himmler's response to these reports combined denial that failure was definitive with threats against commanders whose assessments he characterized as defeatist. The Reichsführer SS insisted that breakthrough was achievable if commanders showed proper determination, that SS troops could accomplish missions that seemed impossible if properly led, that defeatism rather than operational realities was preventing success. General Maximilian de Angelis, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army, within which SS relief forces were operating, provided assessment to Himmler that was more direct than SS officers felt comfortable delivering. De Angelis stated that relief of Budapest was operationally impossible with available forces, that Soviet superiority in numbers and defensive preparation could not be overcome through determination alone, that withdrawing Budapest garrison before it was destroyed should be authorized immediately. Himmler's response was to question de Angelis's loyalty and to insist that Wehrmacht defeatism was undermining operations that SS determination could accomplish. The deterioration of Budapest garrison's situation through January reflected the failure of relief operations and the consequences of Hitler's insistence that the city be held. Supplies within Budapest were exhausted by late January. Ammunition was rationed to minimal levels. Food supplies had been consumed, forcing garrison to slaughter horses for meat. Medical supplies were insufficient to treat wounded, who numbered in thousands. The garrison's combat effectiveness had declined to point where defending entire city perimeter was impossible, forcing withdrawal into progressively smaller defensive sectors within Budapest. The specific conditions inside besieged Budapest by late January illustrated the desperation of garrison's situation. German and Hungarian troops occupied ruins of buildings destroyed by Soviet artillery and air attacks, lived in cellars and basements to escape bombardment that continued day and night, survived on rations that provided fewer than 1,000 calories daily. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals in cellars where surgical operations were performed without adequate anesthesia, where infection rates approached 50% due to unsanitary conditions, where doctors made triage decisions about which wounded could be saved and which must be left to die due to limited medical resources. The civilian population trapped in Budapest suffered even worse conditions than garrison forces. Civilians lacked access to military food supplies, however inadequate those were, survived by consuming whatever could be found, including pets and vermin, died by thousands from starvation and from diseases that spread in unsanitary conditions. Civilian casualties from Soviet bombardment mounted daily as artillery and air attacks made no distinction between military and civilian areas, as buildings collapsed, burying residents in rubble, as water and sanitation systems failed, creating health crisis. The civilian suffering demonstrated consequences of Hitler's fortress city strategy that committed entire urban populations to enduring sieges regardless of humanitarian costs. The command situation within Budapest deteriorated as communications with outside German forces became intermittent, then ceased entirely. Pfeffer-Wildenbruch's ability to coordinate defensive operations declined as telephone lines were severed by artillery fire, as radio communications were disrupted by Soviet jamming, as runners carrying messages between units were killed or captured. The isolation meant that Garrison Command made decisions based on incomplete information about Soviet dispositions, could not coordinate with relief forces whose progress Garrison could only estimate from sounds of distant fighting, operated without guidance from higher command about whether to continue holding or to attempt breakout. SS Obergruppenführer Pfeffer-Wildenbruch's reports through late January documented Garrison's deteriorating condition and requested authorization for breakout before remaining forces were too weakened to attempt escape. The reports emphasized that staying in Budapest guaranteed Garrison's destruction, that breakout offered at least possibility that some forces could escape to German lines, that delay reduced chances of successful breakout daily. The requests met with responses from Hitler's headquarters that breakout was forbidden, that Garrison must hold until relieved, that relief operations were being prepared that would reach Budapest soon. The moral and psychological state of Garrison forces by early February reflected recognition that they had been abandoned to certain destruction. Soldiers understood that relief operations had failed, that supplies were exhausted, that continued resistance would end only in death or capture. The knowledge that they were being sacrificed for symbolic purposes, rather than for military necessity, created resentment against commanders who had ordered Budapest held, undermined morale that had sustained resistance through weeks of siege, led to discussions among troops about whether obeying suicidal orders was required by military honor, or whether survival imperative justified disobedience. The February 11th decision by Pfeffer-Wildenbruch to authorize breakout attempt, despite Hitler's prohibition, represented recognition that Garrison faced imminent destruction and that obeying orders guaranteeing annihilation was militarily and morally untenable. Pfeffer-Wildenbruch informed his commanders that breakout would be attempted on night of February 11th to 12th. That objective was to break through Soviet encirclement and reach German lines to the west, that success required speed and coordination that Garrison's weakened condition made problematic. The decision to disobey direct orders from Hitler demonstrated that even commanders in SS forces recognized that ideological loyalty could not override survival imperative. The planning for breakout attempt occurred under impossible conditions, with commanders lacking accurate intelligence about Soviet dispositions, lacking adequate maps of routes to German lines, lacking communications equipment to coordinate movement of units during breakout. The plan designated assembly areas where units would gather before breakout began, specified routes westward that seemed to offer best chances of avoiding Soviet concentrations, assigned order of march with strongest remaining units leading to break through Soviet positions, and weaker units following to exploit breach. The plan was necessarily improvised, given lack of information and resources, represented best that could be achieved under circumstances, rather than solution with high probability of success. The February 11th to 12th breakout attempt demonstrated both the desperation of Garrison's situation and the impossibility of escaping from encirclement that Soviet forces had consolidated over 6 weeks. The breakout began after dark with remaining German forces attempting to move westward through Soviet positions. Soviet forces detected the breakout immediately, brought concentrated fire against German columns, pursued breaking forces with armor and infantry, The chaos of night breakout under fire resulted in units becoming separated, in wounded being abandoned, in command and control breaking down completely. The destruction of most breakout forces within hours of attempt beginning represented catastrophic end to Budapest siege. Soviet forces systematically destroyed German columns attempting to escape, pursued survivors into the hills west of Budapest, captured or killed garrison remnants. Of approximately 100,000 German and Hungarian troops in Budapest, when siege began, fewer than 800 reached German lines successfully. The remaining forces were killed in the fighting or captured by Soviet forces, with substantial numbers dying during breakout attempt itself. The casualty ratio, over 99% of garrison destroyed or captured, demonstrated completeness of disaster and validated that breakout should have been authorized weeks earlier, when garrison still possessed strength to execute it effectively. SS Obergruppenführer Pfeffer Wildenbruch's reports through late January documented garrison's deteriorating condition and requested authorization for breakout before remaining forces were too weakened to attempt escape. The reports emphasized that staying in Budapest guaranteed garrison's destruction, that breakout offered at least possibility that some forces could escape to German lines, that delay reduced chances of successful breakout daily. The requests met with responses from Hitler's headquarters that breakout was forbidden, that garrison must hold until relieved, that relief operations were being prepared, that would reach Budapest soon. The February 11th decision by Pfeffer Wildenbruch to authorize breakout attempt, despite Hitler's prohibition, represented recognition that garrison faced imminent destruction and that obeying orders guaranteeing annihilation was militarily and morally untenable. Pfeffer Wildenbruch informed his commanders that breakout would be attempted on night of February 11th to 12th, that objective was to break through Soviet encirclement and reach German lines to the west, that success required speed and coordination, that garrison's weakened condition made problematic. The decision to disobey direct orders from Hitler demonstrated that even commanders in SS forces recognized that ideological loyalty could not override survival imperative. The February 11th to 12th breakout attempt demonstrated both the desperation of garrison's situation and the impossibility of escaping from encirclement that Soviet forces had consolidated over 6 weeks. The breakout began after dark, with remaining German forces attempting to move westward through Soviet positions. Soviet forces detected the breakout immediately, brought concentrated fire against German columns, pursued breaking forces with armor and infantry. The chaos of night breakout under fire resulted in units becoming separated, in wounded being abandoned, in command and control breaking down completely. The destruction of most breakout forces within hours of attempt beginning represented catastrophic end to Budapest siege. Soviet forces systematically destroyed German columns attempting to escape, pursued survivors into the hills west of Budapest, captured or killed garrison remnants. Of approximately 100,000 German and Hungarian troops in Budapest when siege began, fewer than 800 reached German lines successfully. The remaining forces were killed in the fighting or captured by Soviet forces, with substantial numbers dying during breakout attempt itself. The February 13th final radio transmission from Budapest reporting that organized resistance had ceased and that garrison had been destroyed reached Himmler while he was attempting to organize defensive operations along the Oder River. The transmission represented complete failure of everything Himmler had attempted regarding Budapest. The city had not been held, relief operations had failed catastrophically, garrison had been destroyed attempting breakout. SS formations committed to relief had suffered severe casualties without achieving objectives. The failure validated every warning that professional military officers had provided about operational impossibility of relieving Budapest and about futility of defending the city. The casualties that Budapest operations had cost reflected scale of disaster. The garrison losses included approximately 70,000 killed, and 30,000 captured. The relief operations cost additional tens of thousands of casualties in SS Panzer divisions that had been committed. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks and assault guns, thousands of vehicles, substantial artillery. The losses represented forces and equipment that Germany could not replace and that were desperately needed for defending against Soviet offensives elsewhere. The strategic consequences of Budapest's fall extended beyond immediate tactical defeat. The Soviet capture of Budapest opened Hungary to Soviet occupation, eliminated German control of Hungarian resources, positioned Soviet forces for advances toward Vienna and southern Germany. The defeat demonstrated that German defensive capabilities had deteriorated to a point where even fortress cities defended by elite forces could not be held against sustained Soviet attacks. Himmler's response to Budapest's fall combined denial of responsibility with attempts to blame subordinate commanders for defeat. The Reichsführer SS insisted that relief operations had failed because commanders lacked determination, that garrison had been destroyed because Pfeffer Wildenbruch had disobeyed orders by attempting breakout. That defeat reflected failures of execution rather than flawed strategy or impossible missions. The blame assignment ignored that Himmler had ordered the operations whose failure he now attributed to others. The February discussions at Hitler's headquarters about Budapest's fall revealed that even the Führer recognized that Himmler's military leadership had been inadequate. Hitler criticized the relief operations' planning and execution, questioned whether Himmler had committed adequate forces, suggested that different commanders might have achieved success. The criticism represented a rare instance of Hitler acknowledging that one of his major subordinates had failed in assigned mission. Though Hitler did not draw a conclusion that appointing political leaders to military command positions was fundamentally flawed approach. The impact on SS morale of Budapest disaster was significant despite efforts to minimize its importance. SS formations that had participated in relief operations understood that they had been committed to impossible missions, that casualties had been excessive relative to achievements, that their elite status had not translated into operational success. The survivors questioned whether SS superiority that propaganda proclaimed was real if SS divisions could not accomplish missions that Himmler assured them were achievable. The professional Wehrmacht officers' assessment of Budapest operations was that they demonstrated definitively that Himmler lacked competence for field command. The officers noted that relief operations had been planned without adequate intelligence about Soviet defenses, that forces had been committed without realistic assessment of success probability, that operational direction had prioritized ideological considerations over military realities. The assessment concluded that appointing Himmler to command Army Group Vistula represented Hitler's preference for political reliability over military competence at a moment when competent leadership was desperately needed. The comparison between Himmler's performance at Budapest and Field Marshal Model's defensive operations elsewhere illuminated differences between political appointee and professional commander. Model, conducting defense along Western Front, achieved economy of force through tactical withdrawals, preserved combat capability through avoiding encirclements, maintained coherent defensive lines despite numerical inferiority. Himmler's insistence on holding Budapest regardless of cost, commitment of forces to relief operations without adequate planning, refusal to authorize breakout when that became only option to preserve forces, demonstrated that political will was not substitute for military competence. The March 1945 relief of Himmler from command of Army Group Vistula represented implicit acknowledgement that his military leadership had failed. The official explanation emphasized Himmler's need to focus on other duties, avoided stating directly that he had proven inadequate as field commander, preserved facade that Reichsführer SS remained competent leader. The reality understood by informed observers was that Budapest disaster combined with poor performance commanding Army Group Vistula, had demonstrated that Himmler could not successfully command field forces regardless of his authority over SS and police apparatus. The permanent damage to Himmler's standing within Nazi hierarchy resulted from Budapest's fall. Prior to Budapest, Himmler had been second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany, controlled vast SS and police empire, was considered potential successor to Hitler. After Budapest, Himmler's military incompetence was evident even to those who had previously accepted his claims of broad competence. His influence over strategic decisions declined. His relationship with Hitler deteriorated. The trajectory from height of power in mid-1944 to marginalization by spring 1945 reflected that, even in Nazi system, catastrophic failure had consequences for leaders who could not deliver promised results. The April 1945 collapse of German defenses in Hungary, following Budapest's fall, demonstrated that city's loss had opened entire region to Soviet conquest. Soviet forces advanced through Hungary into Austria, captured Vienna, positioned themselves for final offensive towards southern Germany. The advances validated that Budapest had been strategically important, and that its loss had severe consequences, though whether holding the city longer would have altered ultimate outcomes remained questionable given overall strategic situation. The post-war assessment of Budapest's siege and relief operations concluded that they represented military disaster of first magnitude, that tens of thousands of German troops had been sacrificed for no strategic gain, that elite SS formations had been consumed in futile operations that competent military planning would have recognized as impossible. The assessment identified Himmler's command as primary factor in disaster, noted that professional military officers had warned that operations were not feasible, concluded that political appointees commanding field forces was recipe for catastrophe. The specific failures in Budapest operations that post-war analysis identified included inadequate intelligence about Soviet defensive capabilities, unrealistic assessment of German forces' ability to penetrate those defenses, refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals when operations failed to achieve objectives, commitment of additional forces to failed strategies, rather than recognizing that fundamental approach was flawed. The analysis noted that each of these failures reflected Himmler's lack of military training and his substitution of ideological conviction for professional military judgment. The conclusion was that Budapest represented case study in how not to conduct military operations, and that appointing commanders based on political criteria rather than military competence had predictable catastrophic results. The comparison with successful defensive operations conducted by professional commanders highlighted differences that Himmler's political appointment created. Field Marshal Model's defense of Ruhr Pocket, while ultimately unsuccessful, preserved forces longer through tactical skill and delayed Allied advances through competent use of terrain and reserves. General Gotthard Heinrich's defense of Oder River positions demonstrated how professional commander could extract maximum defensive value from limited forces through positioning and timing. Himmler's Budapest operations, by contrast, showed political appointee committing forces to impossible missions, refusing to acknowledge operational realities, blaming subordinates for failures that stemmed from strategic misconceptions. The moment when Himmler faced Budapest's fall cannot be identified as single revelation, because recognition came progressively through January and February 1945. The failure of first relief attempt demonstrated that garrison could not be relieved through conventional operations. The failure of second relief attempt confirmed that additional forces would not alter outcome. The garrison's destruction during breakout validated that defending Budapest had resulted in complete loss of forces that might have been saved through earlier withdrawal. The cumulative learning forced Himmler to confront that military realities could not be overcome through ideological determination, that his lack of military training mattered despite his political authority, That responsibility for disaster rested with Commander, who had ordered impossible operations. The final assessment was that Himmler faced Budapest's fall, with combination of denial, blame deflection, and implicit recognition that his military command had been catastrophic failure. The Reichsführer SS never publicly acknowledged that relief operations had been fundamentally misconceived, never admitted that holding Budapest had been operationally unsound decision, never accepted personal responsibility for casualties that operations had caused. Yet Himmler's removal from field command and his declining influence within Nazi hierarchy through final months of war demonstrated that others recognized what he would not admit: that Budapest had exposed his military incompetence, that elite forces had been squandered under his command, that political reliability was inadequate qualification for operational command. The fall of Budapest marked Himmler's failure as military leader and contributed to broader Nazi leadership's recognition that war was lost and that ideological fervor could not reverse military defeats that competent leadership might have mitigated, if not prevented entirely.